Welcome to 221B Stories, where every story invites you into a world of secrets and surprises. Grab your coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Sherlock Holmes and the Mystery of the Poisoned Pen. Chapter 1. The cold morning fog clung to the streets of London, its thick tendrils curling between the towering buildings like fingers, pulling the city into an almost suffocating stillness. The usual hustle of carriages and foot traffic had quieted, and in its place, only the distant echo of horses' hooves and the occasional clang of church bells reached the ears of those who remained awake. At 221B Baker Street, the faint sound of a doorbell broke the silence, drawing the attention of Sherlock Holmes. He sat, as always, in his chair, his mind immersed in the latest collection of newspapers. Watson, ever the loyal companion, stood by the fireplace, his brow furrowing as the day's papers were laid out on the table in front of him. Neither spoke. The faint creak of footsteps echoed outside the door before it opened with a sudden gust of cold air. Inspector Lestrade entered, his face ashen, his usual briskness replaced by an odd sort of hesitance. He removed his coat quickly, his hands still trembling slightly as he reached into his pocket. "Holmes, Watson, I need your help," Lestrade said, his voice tight. "Lord Percival Ashcroft is dead." "Dead?" Holmes's voice was low, sharp as a blade. He did not look up from his papers. "Murder?" "Yes, but there's no sign of foul play," Lestrade replied, his eyes searching Holmes's face for some sort of clue as to what should come next. "He was found dead in his study this morning, a letter in his hand. No wounds, no poisons, nothing to indicate how he died. But the letter—" Lestrade paused for a moment, as if unsure of how to proceed. He pulled the letter from his coat pocket and laid it on the table. Holmes' eyes finally lifted from the papers, and he leaned forward, intrigued. The letter was unlike any other. The paper was heavy, and the ink seemed almost too deliberate. The only words written were chilling. "The past writes its dues in poison." Holmes picked up the letter, his fingers tracing the edges of the words, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Interesting. The handwriting is deliberate, almost formal. The ink," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the faint, delicate texture of the letter. "It's not ordinary ink. This might be our first clue." Watson leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "But what does it mean, Holmes? The past writes its dues in poison. Surely that's a cryptic message. But what could it signify in the context of Lord Ashcroft's death?" Holmes straightened in his chair, staring into the fire as though it might hold the answers. His mind was already spinning with connections, with theories, though the true puzzle remained unclear. "It suggests a connection to something long buried, an old grudge perhaps, and poison, a slow, insidious weapon. But why target Ashcroft?" Lestrade's face twisted in frustration. "That's what we need you to figure out, Holmes. We found no signs of any poison, no external injuries. It's as though he simply collapsed." Holmes rose from his chair, his mind already sorting through the possibilities. His keen eye flicked toward the desk, where the other documents lay in neat piles. "And yet, you're sure this is not a natural death?" Lestrade hesitated but nodded. "Yes, it's unnatural, Holmes. The letter was in his hand, and his death came so suddenly." Holmes's eyes gleamed with an almost predatory intensity as he turned to Lestrade. "Then the question becomes, who sent the letter, and what is their motive?" He walked toward the window, the fog outside swirling like a living entity. "We shall need to investigate, and swiftly. If Ashcroft was murdered, then this was no random act. Someone planned this, and they want us to uncover the truth. But we must not be misled. Every word, every clue, must be examined carefully. For the poison in this case may not be a literal one, but one that seeps through the fabric of the past itself. Lestrade nodded grimly. Where should we begin? Holmes turned back to face him, his mind already racing. First, we must learn who stood to benefit from Ashcroft's death. And second, we must discover the significance of this letter. The answer lies not only in the victim's present, but in the shadows of his past. With that, Holmes swept out of the room, Watson at his heels. The chase for the truth had begun, but in this case, the truth was a slippery thing, hidden behind layers of time, deception, and perhaps something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before moving to the next chapter, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another incredible story waiting for you. Chapter 2. The streets of London had long since drowned in the weight of a heavy grey fog, as though the city itself were hiding secrets from the light of day. Sherlock Holmes paced the room with his usual restlessness, his sharp mind calculating, processing, while Watson watched with a sense of uneasy anticipation. Inspector Lestrade, who had become a familiar figure at the door, entered once again, this time with a mix of frustration and concern visible on his face. "You've had time to think, Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice carrying the weight of his exhaustion. "We've been asking everyone who might have known Lord Ashcroft for any sign of motive, and yet nothing. His life was spotless, his political career secure, his personal relationships unremarkable." He hesitated before continuing. "I cannot find anything at all, that explains his death." Holmes turned slowly, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Lestrade, my dear friend, if there were no motives to uncover, this would be a dull case indeed. But that is never the case, is it?" Watson, who had been silent up until that moment, raised an eyebrow. "So you have a theory already, Holmes?" "Theories are like chess moves, Watson. Each one is made in response to the last. We are simply watching the game unfold." Holmes replied cryptically, his eyes scanning the walls of the room as though searching for something hidden within the very air itself. Lestrade stepped forward, his face tense. "You've spoken of Ashcroft's past, but who among his acquaintances would have reason to hurt him? And why now, of all times?" Holmes paused before answering, his voice growing more thoughtful. "Let us begin with his inner circle, the people closest to him, those who knew him best. Start with Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, his wife, a woman of substantial connections, though her reputation, if we are to be frank, is as tarnished as the silver of her household. We shall see if she holds any piece of the puzzle. Then there is Mr. Graham Whitlock, his political rival, a man whose name is often whispered in the same breath as scandal. Could this be the perfect opportunity for Whitlock to eliminate an obstacle?" Lestrade shook his head in frustration. "I've already spoken with Lady Ashcroft. She seems genuinely distressed, and Whitlock has an airtight alibi. I've spoken to everyone in Ashcroft's immediate circle, Holmes. No one's got a reason to kill him." Holmes chuckled softly, his gaze flickering with intrigue. "Lestrade, you are so focused on what is visible, you're missing what's hidden in plain sight. What if the motive is not political, Not personal in the way you assume, but something much deeper. Watson's interest was piqued, and he leaned in slightly. "What do you mean, Holmes?" "Consider this, Watson," Holmes continued, his voice taking on a darker edge. "Lord Ashcroft's reputation was impeccable. He was well loved, respected. Yet if one were to truly look beneath the surface, one might discover a long history of debts unpaid, of promises broken, and of decisions made that affected far more people than he ever realized. Could it be that someone from his past has finally come to collect?" Watson's brow furrowed, and he took a deep breath. "You think someone from his past might be behind this?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "We must not overlook the past, Watson. It has a way of resurfacing when least expected. Ashcroft's old political maneuvers, perhaps, or even a long-forgotten scandal. We must seek out those from his past who may have held a grudge long enough to settle it now." Lestrade was less convinced, his skepticism clear. "You're asking us to dig through Ashcroft's past, like we're searching through a graveyard of old secrets." Holmes looked at Lestrade, a sharp glint in his eyes. "Exactly. Because, Lestrade, sometimes the dead have the most to tell us. I suggest we pay a visit to his home, to his wife, to Whitlock. Yes, even to Miss Clara Hawthorne, his secretary, who may have seen more than she is letting on. It is time we unravel this carefully woven facade." Lestrade paused, uncertainty lingering. "And the letter? The one you found at the scene?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "It will be examined in detail, but I suspect it's a clue, not just in its content, but in its very form. This was no ordinary correspondence. Its creator intended it as a message, but not for the reasons we first assumed. And as for the poison—" Holmes trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "We will find the answer, but we must tread carefully, for this case is much more than a simple murder. It is a trap, set long ago." Chapter 3. The morning fog had begun to lift slightly, though the chill in the air remained as palpable as ever. Holmes and Watson had made their way to Lord Ashcroft's grand estate, a mansion perched on the edge of a quiet street, flanked by tall iron gates and a long, winding driveway. The house seemed a stark contrast to the somber mood inside, its opulent facade reflecting little of the tragedy that had occurred just days before. Holmes stood at the entrance, his piercing eyes scanning the surroundings, taking in every detail: the manicured lawns, the untouched cobblestones leading up to the door, the silent windows that looked as though they hadn't witnessed life in years. The house, like the city itself, held secrets. "Have you ever noticed, Watson," Holmes began as they made their way inside, "that people's lives are often mirrored by their homes? The way the furniture is arranged, the choice of portraits on the walls, the very smell of a place. In cases like these, where the victim is so perfectly polished on the outside, the truth tends to hide in the smallest of details." Watson nodded, trying to make sense of Holmes' words. "You mean that Ashcroft's home could tell us something about his life, something that people didn't know?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing as he observed the large entryway. "When we strip away the politics, the reputation, the layers of wealth, we begin to see something more honest, the human side of the story. And that, my dear Watson, is where the true motive often lies." The door opened, revealing Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, her face pale, her eyes puffy from sleepless nights. She stepped aside, letting them in, but her expression remained guarded. She was not the grieving widow Holmes had expected. No, there was something more calculated in her demeanor, something that suggested she was playing a role. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Lady Ashcroft greeted them with a stiff, almost rehearsed politeness. "I'm afraid I'm not in the best of spirits, but I trust you'll understand. Lord Ashcroft's sudden passing has left me in a state of shock. How can I be of service?" Holmes observed her closely. Her appearance was immaculate, but there was a faint tremble in her voice. A subtle giveaway, one that many would have missed. Holmes stepped forward with the calm assurance that he was accustomed to, extending his hand in a gesture of polite greeting. "Lady Ashcroft, we are deeply sorry for your loss. We understand how difficult this time must be. However, we must press on with our inquiries. The circumstances surrounding your husband's death are unusual, and it is important we gather every possible detail. May we ask you about the events leading up to his passing?" Lady Ashcroft stiffened for a moment, her lips tightening as if preparing for a question she had not anticipated. She nodded slowly, her composure returning. "Of course. Ask whatever you need, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took his time, his gaze flicking over the fine furniture, the portraits of family members lining the walls. "I must ask, Lady Ashcroft, what can you tell us of your husband's recent activities? Was there anything unusual about his behavior leading up to his death?" A brief pause lingered between them, the air heavy with expectation. Lady Ashcroft's gaze dropped to her hands, and she folded them neatly in front of her. "No," she replied quickly, though there was a slight tremor in her voice. "Nothing unusual. Lord Ashcroft was a man of routine, always at his desk, always meeting with people, discussing policies and matters of state. He did have a few late-night meetings in the weeks prior to his death, but nothing that stood out." Holmes's sharp eyes did not leave her face as he continued. "And did anyone ever seem particularly interested in your husband's affairs? Any guests who seemed overly concerned with his work, or any individuals who may have had a reason to hold a grudge against him?" Lady Ashcroft paused, her gaze flickering momentarily to the staircase, as if searching for the right answer. "There were many people who didn't agree with Lord Ashcroft's views, of course. Politics, you know. But I can't think of anyone who would have gone so far as to take matters into their own hands." Holmes leaned in slightly, his voice lowering, his gaze unwavering. "You are sure of that?" Lady Ashcroft's eyes met his, and for the first time there was a flicker of something deeper, a hint of a lie expertly concealed behind her calm exterior. "I am as sure as I can be." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, though he didn't press further just yet. "Very well, Lady Ashcroft. We will continue our investigation. But one last question. Your husband's secretary, Miss Clara Hawthorne, was she close to Lord Ashcroft?" At the mention of Miss Hawthorne, Lady Ashcroft's composure faltered just slightly. "Miss Hawthorne? Yes. She was efficient, always at Lord Ashcroft's side. But there was nothing unusual in their relationship. She was simply doing her job." Holmes smiled slightly, sensing the crack in Lady Ashcroft's armor. He knew that every word spoken carried weight. "Thank you, Lady Ashcroft. You have been most helpful." As they were escorted out, Watson glanced at Holmes, who seemed lost in thought. "What do you make of her, Holmes?" "She lies with every word," Holmes replied quietly, his eyes scanning the surroundings one last time. "But not out of malice. Out of fear of something. Or someone." The mystery deepened. The pieces were starting to align, but Holmes knew there was much more to uncover. It wasn't just a matter of finding a killer. No, this was something far more complex. An intricate web of politics, personal vendettas, and deep-seated secrets. Chapter 4. The search for answers had led them deeper into the labyrinth of Lord Ashcroft's life. Holmes and Watson, after leaving the Ashcroft estate, made their way to Miss Clara Hawthorne's apartment in the heart of the city. The fog that had hung over London in the morning seemed to have only thickened, a fitting backdrop for a case that was becoming murkier by the hour. The dim, gaslit streets were nearly deserted, with the usual hum of life dampened by the ominous weight of the unfolding mystery. Miss Hawthorne's residence, though modest in comparison to Ashcroft's mansion, held a certain air of quiet efficiency. The door was opened by a woman in her early 30s, her face pale and her eyes cautious. Clara Hawthorne's appearance matched her reputation as Lord Ashcroft's dutiful secretary, professional, orderly, and unremarkable. Yet as Holmes studied her, he couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. It was more than just the way she carried herself. It was something in her posture, her forced calmness. A woman who had worked so closely with Ashcroft could not possibly remain unaffected by his sudden, mysterious death. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Miss Hawthorne greeted them coolly, stepping aside to allow them entry. "I'm afraid I don't have much information to offer, but I'm willing to assist you in any way I can." Holmes gave her a quick nod but did not immediately speak. Instead, he took a moment to observe the space, neatly arranged bookshelves, a tidy desk with stacks of papers, and a few personal effects scattered here and there. The room itself was devoid of any emotional clutter, as though Miss Hawthorne had made a deliberate effort to distance herself from any personal attachment to the late Lord Ashcroft. "Miss Hawthorne," Holmes began, his voice steady, "I understand that you worked closely with Lord Ashcroft for quite some time. May I ask, did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to his death?" Miss Hawthorne paused, her lips pressing together in thought. "Unusual? No, nothing that comes to mind," she said quickly, though Holmes noted the slight hesitation before she spoke. "Lord Ashcroft was, as always, focused on his duties. He did seem more preoccupied than usual, but that is not uncommon for a man of his position." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "More preoccupied? In what way, exactly?" The woman shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance toward the window, as if seeking solace in the distant view. "Well," she hesitated, "he had been receiving strange letters recently, letters with no return address. I thought little of it at the time. People send strange things all the time, don't they?" Her attempt at nonchalance was evident, but Holmes wasn't fooled. This was a key detail, one that had slipped from her mind only to resurface under the right pressure. "Strange letters, you say?" Watson interjected, leaning in with genuine curiosity. "Did these letters seem threatening? Were they from anyone you recognized?" "No," she answered quickly. They didn't seem threatening, just cryptic. I didn't think much of them." Her voice faltered just slightly, as if she were trying to downplay the significance. "But Lord Ashcroft, he seemed more anxious after receiving them." Holmes took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Miss Hawthorne, I must ask, what was the content of these letters?" Miss Hawthorne visibly stiffened, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She hesitated, but finally spoke, the words barely escaping her lips. "They were always the same. The past writes its dues in poison. That's all they said." She looked away, the unease in her expression growing. I didn't think much of them at first. But when the death occurred, She trailed off, her voice faltering. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with Watson, then turned back to Miss Hawthorne. "And did you ever show these letters to anyone else? Perhaps Lord Ashcroft discussed them with you?" "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "No one else. I thought they were harmless, but after Lord Ashcroft's death I couldn't help but think, perhaps they meant something after all." Watson, who had been silently observing the exchange, spoke up. "Miss Hawthorne, surely you must have some idea as to who might have sent these letters. Was there anyone from Ashcroft's past who might have had a reason to contact him in such a cryptic manner?" Miss Hawthorne's gaze flickered nervously, and for a moment she seemed to shrink into herself. She swallowed hard before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. But I do know that Lord Ashcroft had enemies. He made many enemies in his line of work, some of whom he crossed in ways that were never talked about. She looked at Holmes, her eyes wide with fear. I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes. I don't know more than that. Holmes stood silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. This was the peace he had been waiting for. Ashcroft's past, hidden away from the public eye, was beginning to surface. An unfinished story, a network of old wounds that had never fully healed. The words of the letter, so haunting in their simplicity, were not just a warning. They were a message, a clue from someone who had been wronged, someone who now sought a cruel form of justice. Thank you for your time, Miss Hawthorne, Holmes said quietly, his mind already spinning with the possibilities. We shall be in touch if we require any further information. As they left her apartment, Holmes's eyes remained focused ahead, his expression unreadable. What do you think, Watson? He asked after a long pause. I think Miss Hawthorne knows more than she's letting on, Watson replied. She's hiding something. Holmes nodded. Indeed. But what? And why? We will need to dig deeper into Ashcroft's past. There is something there, a key to this puzzle. Someone is using it as a weapon, and we must find out who. Chapter 5. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn, and yet Sherlock Holmes was never one to shy away from complexity. He and Watson spent the following days poring over Lord Ashcroft's past, sifting through records, letters, and old political documents, seeking any connection between Ashcroft's sudden death and the cryptic message that had been left behind. Holmes, however, was less concerned with the documents themselves than with the silent implications that seemed to lurk in the shadows of Ashcroft's life. By mid-afternoon, they found themselves standing outside a weathered building in the heart of the city. Holmes had insisted that they visit an old literary society that had once been frequented by Ashcroft. It was a place that had faded from public view, a place that had known the darker corners of politics and the type of people whose names were seldom spoken aloud. Holmes had a gut feeling that the truth might be hiding among these forgotten figures, the ones Ashcroft had left behind, and the ones who might have been harboring old grudges. Holmes knocked sharply on the door, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a heightened sense of urgency. It was opened by an elderly man, his face a map of age and experience, his eyes sharp despite his stooped posture. The man's eyes immediately settled on Holmes, as though he recognized him before a word was spoken. Mr. Holmes, the man said, his voice gravelly, but with a certain warmth. I had a feeling you would come here eventually. What is it you seek? Holmes glanced over his shoulder at Watson, who stood with his arms folded, his eyes scanning the street. I seek the past, Mr. Jenkins. More specifically, I seek to understand a connection between Lord Ashcroft and certain members of your society. Do you remember him? The elderly man nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. Ashcroft? Yes, I remember him. He was a member once, though not for long. Left under peculiar circumstances. The sort of man who could have made enemies easily, and with the wrong people. Holmes's interest piqued. Enemies? What sort of enemies? Mr. Jenkins stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Not the kind you find in the light of day, Mr. Holmes, the kind that lurk in the shadows, where the laws of decency no longer apply. Ashcroft was brilliant, yes, but there were whispers. His rise to power wasn't without its cost. He'd crossed paths with a man who had made a business out of vengeance. Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A business of vengeance? Jenkins lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "There's a man named Carrington, a poet once of some renown. He fell out of favor, his works forgotten by the public. A man full of bitterness, and a man Ashcroft did wrong all those years ago. Carrington never forgot. He'd vowed to make Ashcroft pay." Holmes took a step closer, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "And you think this is who's behind Ashcroft's death?" Jenkins paused, his expression unreadable. "I can't say for sure, but I will tell you this. Carrington's ways were subtle. He didn't just seek to harm you directly. He'd break your spirit first. He'd attack your reputation, manipulate the people around you, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. He never used force unless it was necessary. His weapon was always words, and his poison was always in the form of manipulation." Watson stepped forward, clearly disturbed by what he was hearing. "So you're suggesting that Carrington might have been behind the cryptic letters? That the poison wasn't literal?" Holmes turned to Watson, his mind already piecing the puzzle together. "Yes, Watson. It wasn't a physical poison that killed Ashcroft. It was something far more insidious. It was the poison of his own past catching up with him. The letter was the key. It was a message, a warning, that Carrington had been watching from the shadows all along, biding his time." Jenkins seemed uncomfortable, his fingers trembling as he clutched at the edge of his chair. "I don't know what more I can tell you, Mr. Holmes. Carrington disappeared years ago, after Ashcroft's rise to power. No one's heard from him since, but I know the kind of man Carrington was. He would stop at nothing. And the letters? They're his signature, a final reminder that no one can escape the past." Holmes stood still, processing the information, his mind racing with the possibilities. Carrington may have been the architect of Ashcroft's downfall, but we still don't know why he waited until now to strike. "Perhaps," Jenkins mused, his voice dropping, "the poison had always been there, festering, and Ashcroft's past was the final catalyst. Carrington never forgets a slight." Holmes gave a sharp nod. "Indeed. And now, we must find Carrington. He's the key to unraveling this mystery, but I suspect our search will not be an easy one." Watson was visibly shaken by the implications. "But where do we begin, Holmes? If Carrington's disappeared—" Holmes smiled, the same cold, calculating smile that indicated he was already steps ahead. "We begin by revisiting Ashcroft's personal files. The past, Watson, always leaves traces. Even the most well-hidden secrets eventually find their way into the light." Chapter 6. The clock in the study of 221B Baker Street ticked away the moments as Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade gathered around a collection of documents scattered across the table. The investigation had taken an unexpected but crucial turn. If they were to solve the case, the past of Lord Ashcroft, his tangled political maneuvers, and his hidden transgressions would all need to be carefully examined. Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he stared at the papers in front of him, deep in thought. "It all makes sense now," Holmes muttered, his sharp eyes gleaming with intensity. Carrington, a forgotten poet with nothing left to lose, must have turned to his bitter past to exact his revenge. But revenge is not the only motive here. It is the timing that intrigues me most. Lestrade, still looking perplexed, leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "But why now, Holmes? Why did Carrington wait all these years to strike? The man's been in hiding for decades." Holmes paused, his gaze lifting from the documents as he looked directly at Lestrade. Because, my dear Lestrade, Ashcroft's actions in the past have finally caught up with him. There was a point where Carrington was simply biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment. Ashcroft's political career reached its pinnacle, and that, I believe, is what finally triggered Carrington's return. Watson shifted in his seat, leaning forward as well. So you think Ashcroft's rise to power, the success he achieved, was the key to Carrington's long wait? Precisely, Watson, Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. Ashcroft built his career on the backs of others, trampling those who had once been his peers. Carrington, a man who once had promise, was destroyed in the process. And now Ashcroft, for all his wealth and power, has become a target. Carrington never forgot the betrayal. Lestrade, who had been silent for a moment, broke in with a thoughtful question. But what's the connection to the letter, Holmes? The cryptic message, "The past writes its dues in poison." Is that Carrington's work as well? Holmes nodded slowly, a faint smile forming on his lips, as if the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The letter, Lestrade, is not just a message. It is a statement of intent. Carrington, skilled with words as he is, used that letter to remind Ashcroft of his sins, to tell him that the poison of his past would inevitably come to collect. Watson frowned, trying to wrap his mind around the complexities of the case. But if Carrington had been in hiding for so long, how did he have access to Ashcroft's affairs? How did he know that Ashcroft's death was the final piece of his plan? Holmes' eyes sparkled with excitement as he leaned forward, eagerly awaiting the next step of the investigation. Because, Watson, Carrington was not as hidden as we thought. The truth is, there are shadows within shadows. Ashcroft's enemies were never truly gone. They've been lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to act. Lestrade looked at Holmes, confused but curious. Are you suggesting that Ashcroft's death wasn't just Carrington's doing? That there's more to this than one man seeking revenge? Holmes nodded gravely. Yes, Lestrade. Carrington may have been the catalyst, but there is something more here. Someone else who has been manipulating events from behind the scenes. I have reason to believe that Lord Ashcroft's death was not a singular act of vengeance, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver involving multiple players. Watson's brow furrowed as he thought of all the people involved in Ashcroft's life. The political figures, the business associates, even Lady Eleanor, his wife. Are you saying there are others involved? Other people who stand to gain from Ashcroft's death? Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. Exactly, Watson. What we have here is not just a crime of passion or revenge. This is the result of years of careful manipulation, a game of political chess played with deadly precision. The letter was only the beginning. Whoever is behind this has carefully set the pieces into motion, ensuring that Ashcroft's demise would be both inevitable and a public spectacle. Lestrade looked back at Holmes, a sense of disbelief creeping into his voice. But who could have had that kind of power? Who could have been pulling the strings all this time? Holmes's gaze sharpened as he rose to his feet, the weight of the mystery settling heavily on his shoulders. It is not just one person, Lestrade. It is a network, one that has been hiding in plain sight. People Ashcroft knew well, people he wronged, are still out there, waiting for their opportunity. We must dig deeper into Ashcroft's political connections, into the debts he never repaid, and the alliances he betrayed. He turned toward the window, his mind already moving toward the next step. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall visit the one place where all these threads might finally converge, the Records Office. There we will find the true extent of Ashcroft's dealings, and perhaps, just perhaps, the names of those who have waited years for this moment. Lestrade stood up slowly, his face marked with both frustration and admiration. You really believe that, don't you? That this is more than just a man with a vendetta? Holmes turned back to Lestrade, his eyes filled with the cold certainty that only a master detective could possess. I know it, Lestrade. Ashcroft's death was never just a tragedy. It was the endgame of a long and carefully planned series of moves, and now it is our turn to take action. Chapter 7. The next day, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade made their way through the labyrinth of government offices, arriving at the records department with an air of quiet determination. The stone walls and dimly lit corridors seemed to hold the weight of centuries of secrets, and Holmes walked through them with the poise of a man who had made a lifetime of uncovering such hidden truths. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the three of them entered the room, the smell of old paper and dust hanging in the air. Holmes wasted no time. He strode directly to the filing cabinets and began flipping through them with remarkable speed, his keen mind already sorting through the vast amounts of information. Watson stood by, watching the detective work, and even Lestrade, usually so skeptical, couldn't help but admire Holmes' methodical approach. "You see, Watson," Holmes said, not looking up from the files, "we are looking for the smallest of clues. A name, a transaction, anything that links Ashcroft's past actions to his death. It's all there, hidden within these documents, waiting for someone to recognize it." Lestrade, who had been quietly observing the detective, finally spoke up. "But how do you know this will work, Holmes? How do you know this network you speak of really exists?" Holmes paused for a moment, his eyes still scanning the files. "Because, Lestrade, these people do not disappear. They simply wait, biding their time. Ashcroft's political career was built on the backs of those he betrayed. There is no such thing as a perfect victory, especially when it comes to power. His rise to the top was never without consequence." He continued flipping through the folders with precision, muttering to himself as he read through the details of Ashcroft's various business dealings and political connections. It was not long before he stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Here it is," he said, his voice sharp. Watson stepped forward, eager to see what Holmes had uncovered. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes handed him a yellow document, one that had clearly seen many years of handling. It was a list of names, an old agreement, long buried but never quite forgotten. Ashcroft had once been part of a secret political deal, one that had tied him to several key figures whose names were now all but erased from public memory. The agreement had been made in exchange for Ashcroft's silence regarding a scandalous act that had threatened to ruin several influential families. These were the very same families that had been excluded from the circles Ashcroft now frequented, families whose reputations had been saved by the man who now lay dead. Watson studied the document for a moment, piecing it together. So these people, these families, are the ones who stand to gain from Ashcroft's death? Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming with realization. "Precisely, Watson. Ashcroft's rise to power may have come at the expense of his conscience, but it was never free from the consequences of those he betrayed. They have waited for years, and now they are ready to take back what was once denied to them." Lestrade shook his head, still processing the magnitude of what Holmes was suggesting. "You mean to say that someone within this list, The very people Ashcroft wronged could be behind his death. Holmes stood up, his face set in grim determination. Not just someone, Lestrade. It is not a single hand that has reached for Ashcroft's throat, but rather a network. These families, hidden in the shadows, out of sight, they have been pulling the strings. Ashcroft was a symbol of everything they lost, and they have been planning his fall for years. Watson frowned, his gaze fixed on the document in his hands. But how do you know Carrington is involved in all this? He wasn't a part of Ashcroft's political dealings. Holmes smiled faintly, turning toward the filing cabinets once more. Ah, but Carrington is not just any man. He was once a poet, a man of influence in his own right. And though Ashcroft's political dealings left Carrington behind, they did not erase his bitterness. Carrington, Watson, was the catalyst, the spark that set all this into motion. He knew that Ashcroft would eventually rise too high, and he waited for the right time to strike. Lestrade, his skepticism fading, leaned in closer. "So, you're saying Carrington was the one who sent the letters, using them as a way to remind Ashcroft of his past sins?" Holmes nodded. Exactly. The letters were his way of ensuring that Ashcroft's past would finally catch up to him. They were never about physical harm. They were about reminding Ashcroft, shaking him to the core, that his time was coming to an end. As Holmes turned back to the files, his fingers brushed across a name that sent a ripple through his thoughts. "And here we have it," he said softly. "A name that connects everything." Lestrade stepped forward, eager to know what Holmes had found. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes handed him a small note, one that was almost lost among the other documents. The name on it was unmistakable: Reginald Beaumont. Watson raised an eyebrow. Beaumont? But Holmes, Beaumont was one of Ashcroft's closest allies. What does he have to do with any of this? Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "Ah, Watson, Beaumont may have been Ashcroft's ally, but he was also a man who had everything to lose. And Beaumont's family, well, they were just as entangled in Ashcroft's past as anyone else." Watson's eyes widened with realization. So Beaumont knew about Ashcroft's betrayal. Holmes nodded. Exactly. Beaumont's family was the one Ashcroft had once betrayed, the one whose fortunes Ashcroft had ruined. Beaumont may have stood beside Ashcroft in public, but behind the scenes, he was just as determined to see Ashcroft fall. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and Holmes knew that the final confrontation was imminent. They would have to confront Beaumont and learn the full extent of his involvement. There was no doubt now. Ashcroft's death was not the work of a lone vengeful poet. It was the culmination of years of revenge, betrayal, and manipulation, set in motion by those who had once been wronged. Holmes stood up, his eyes cold with determination. "It's time we paid a visit to Sir Reginald Beaumont. It is he who holds the final key to this mystery."